Hi kids, Pastor Josh here again with today's Bible lesson. Now if you remember correctly, last time we left off, Paul was in prison. He'd been found innocent by Felix, the guy who had been judging his case, but Felix decided to leave Paul in prison as a favor to the Jewish leaders before he left office. So now we're introduced to a new guy in the story. His name is Festus. He's the new governor of the area that is Judea. So he's going around basically touring the area that he's now in charge of. And so one of the places he goes is Jerusalem. Now when he gets there, Caiaphas and the other Jewish leaders come to him and ask that Paul be transferred to Jerusalem so that they can put him on trial, fully intending to have Paul killed somewhere along the way. But Festus says, look, it's not customary for Romans to hand over their prisoners without first letting them have a chance to speak against the charges against them. So if you want to put this Paul guy on trial, come with me when I go back to Caesarea and we'll have his trial there. And so about a week later, Festus returns to Caesarea, and Caiaphas and his goons go with him. So when they're there, Festus makes all the arrangements for Paul to be put on trial again. Again, Caiaphas and his goon squad, they just try to come up with all the kinds of rotten things to say about Paul. All kinds of charges are brought against him, but they can't prove a single one. So when Paul finally has a chance to speak, not only does he say that they can't prove a single thing that they've brought against him, but he uses this as an opportunity to preach. He teaches everyone in attendance about Jesus. And Festus listens, and he decides, there's nothing I can charge this guy with under Roman law. I should be able to free him. But he's also the new boss in the area, and he kind of wants to get things off to a good start with Caiaphas and the Jewish leaders so that they can have a good working relationship. So he thinks maybe a good way to get that started would be to give them a favor and have Paul taken to Jerusalem to be put on trial. But first he asks Paul if he would be willing to do that. And at this time, Paul says, you know what, I've had it with this system. I think it's time to get this over and done with. I appeal to Caesar. Now that might not make sense to you what he says at the last there, but this is a very special right that Paul has as a Roman citizen. Now remember, not everybody who lived in the Roman Empire was a citizen. But those that were had very special rules that had to apply to them. For instance, if a Roman citizen was accused of a crime, they had to be put on trial. They couldn't just be thrown in jail like a non-citizen could. But if a Roman citizen was put on trial and they didn't think that they were getting a fair one, they could appeal to Caesar. Basically, they would say this to whoever the judge was, and the judge was compelled by law to send that person to Rome to have their case judged by the emperor himself. So when Festus hears this, and when he talks to his advisors and finds out that Paul is a Roman citizen, he says, to Caesar you have appealed, and to Caesar you shall go. And at this point, Paul becomes untouchable by Caiaphas and his goon squad. Until Paul can be sent to Rome to be put on trial by Caesar himself, he cannot be touched by the Jewish leaders. He's under Festus's protection. Now, a few days later, Festus has a visitor. His name is King Agrippa. Now, King Agrippa is basically the guy just below Festus in the government of the area. Festus is the guy in charge, but Agrippa's kind of the guy that gets a lot of the stuff done for him. So Agrippa's coming to meet his new boss, talk things over, try to start up a good friendship here. And while they're talking, Festus begins to mention Paul. And he says, honestly, I would have let the guy go given the chance, but he used his right and appealed to Caesar, so I've got to send him to Rome now. But after hearing all this, Agrippa says, no, I've heard about this Paul guy and the Christians that he's a part of. I'd like to hear what he has to say for myself. So Festus makes arrangements for basically a third trial. This time there's no one bringing charges against Paul. It's strictly Paul being given a chance to defend himself. And this time the judge is Agrippa. So Paul is brought before Agrippa, Festus, and anyone else who wants to listen. And when he starts to defend himself, again, he begins to preach. He's on trial for the third time, and he's using this as a chance to tell others about Jesus. Now, as they listen, some of the people in the crowd think that Paul is nuts. I mean, Festus even comes out and says as much. But Paul says, you may think it's crazy, but this is our history I'm talking about. Everything I've spoken of has fulfilled the writings of my people. You don't believe me? Talk to Agrippa here. He's one of us. He knows of the stuff I'm talking about. And Agrippa, he hears this and says, Paul, do you really think in this short of a time you're going to convince me to be a Christian? And Paul says, it's not a matter of time. I don't care who you are in this room. It is my heartfelt hope that at some point each and every person in this room will come to accept Jesus as their Savior and become a Christian. Now, not too long after this, Paul is sent back to his cell, and the trial breaks up. But as they go out, everyone's talking about what Paul has said. Agrippa even turns to Festus and says, if this guy hadn't appealed to Caesar, he could have gone free. There's nothing worth charging him over. Now, if you want to know what happens when Paul gets sent to Rome, well, you'll have to wait and see on Wednesday. But we learn something very important from Paul here. When God gives you an opportunity to teach about Jesus, you gotta take it. I mean, look here. Paul was put on trial 3 times before Felix, before Festus, and before Agrippa. And each time, not only did he defend himself, but he used his defense as an opportunity to teach others about Jesus. As Paul said when he spoke to Agrippa and everyone around him, it was his hope that everyone who heard him speak would someday choose to make Jesus their Savior. Now, if Paul can turn his own defense in a trial into an opportunity to preach, then when we are given an opportunity to tell others about Jesus, no matter how hard the situation is we find ourselves in, we've got to take it.